The mountain air was crisp and cool as Caleb hiked along a trail rarely explored by anyone. The rocky path twisted and turned, leading deeper into the wilderness. For Caleb, this was the perfect escape, a place to forget the noise of the modern world and lose himself in the silence of nature. But today, something was different. His portable tracking device, which he used to navigate tricky terrains, began to buzz softly. At first, he thought it was a malfunction, but the strange, rhythmic pulses on the screen caught his attention. It wasn't just static. It was deliberate, almost like a signal. Curiosity took over. Caleb followed the device's direction, leaving the beaten path and climbing over uneven rocks and dense brush. The further he went, the stronger the signal grew. Soon, he found himself standing in front of an enormous crevasse in the mountainside. It looked unnatural, as though the rock had been split apart by some immense force. As he peered inside, his breath caught. There, partially hidden by debris and overgrown vines, was the silhouette of something metallic, a ship. It was unlike anything Caleb had ever seen before. Its surface shimmered faintly under the dim light, with markings that didn't resemble any language he recognized. He hesitated. Every part of him screamed to turn back, to leave this mystery for someone else to solve. But the signal on his device urged him forward, almost like it was calling to him. Taking a deep breath, Caleb stepped into the crevasse, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and excitement. The air inside was colder, carrying a metallic tang. As Caleb approached the ship, he noticed its entrance was ajar, the door hanging loosely as if it had been forced open years ago. He stepped inside cautiously, his boots echoing softly against the smooth floor. The interior was dark, save for faint, glowing lines running along the walls, pulsing with a weak light. The ship felt ancient and abandoned, yet alive in some strange way. Caleb moved deeper, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. Then he saw it, a strange chamber at the heart of the ship. In the center was a glass pod, fogged from the inside. He wiped the glass with his sleeve, and what he saw made him freeze. Inside the pod was a woman, or at least something resembling one. Her skin was pale, almost luminous, and her hair floated gently around her face, as though suspended in water. She was motionless, her eyes closed, her expression serene yet lifeless. Caleb's mind raced. Was she alive? Was this some kind of alien? The questions overwhelmed him, but one thing was clear. He couldn't leave her here. As he reached out to examine the controls of the pod, a faint hum began to echo through the ship, and lights flickered ominously. Caleb realized he wasn't just exploring anymore. He was waking something up. The faint hum grew louder, vibrating through the metallic walls of the ship. Caleb's hand hovered over the controls of the pod, his pulse quickening. The alien woman inside looked so fragile, yet so otherworldly. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was intruding on something ancient and sacred. He studied the control panel beside the pod, its symbols and patterns glowing faintly. None of it made sense to him, but a single button pulsed with a steady green light, as if inviting him to press it. Caleb hesitated. What if pressing it did more harm than good? What if it wasn't meant to be touched at all? His flashlight flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. He swallowed hard and whispered to himself, "Come on, Caleb. She looks like she needs help. You can't just walk away now." With a deep breath, he pressed the button. The hum turned into a sharp whirring sound, and the glass pod hissed as a cloud of vapor escaped from its edges. Caleb stumbled back, shielding his face as the temperature in the room dropped noticeably. The lights on the pod flickered, and then, with a soft click, the glass slid open. The alien woman's chest rose sharply as she gasped for air. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing irises that shimmered like liquid silver. For a moment, she seemed completely disoriented, her gaze darting around the room before locking onto Caleb. He froze. Her expression shifted from confusion to fear. She tried to move but was too weak to lift herself out of the pod. Caleb raised his hands, palms open, in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. "It's okay," he said softly. "I'm not here to hurt you." She didn't respond, but her eyes narrowed, and she let out a string of strange, melodic sounds. Her language was unlike anything Caleb had ever heard, but her tone carried desperation and warning. "I don't understand you," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But I want to help." Caleb slowly stepped closer and extended his hand. She flinched, her body tensing as if preparing to defend herself. Then, as though realizing she had no choice, she allowed him to help her out of the pod. Her weight was surprisingly light, almost as if gravity affected her differently. As she leaned on him for support, a sudden noise made them both freeze. A distant clang echoed through the ship. Caleb's heart raced. He turned toward the sound, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "We need to get out of here," he said, more to himself than to her. The alien woman seemed to understand his urgency. She tugged weakly at his sleeve, her silver eyes wide with fear. Together, they began moving toward the ship's exit, Caleb's mind swirling with questions. Who was she? What had happened to her? And most importantly, who or what else was inside the ship? Caleb and the alien woman moved quickly through the ship's dark corridors. The air was thick and cold, each breath they took sending a cloud of mist into the silence. The woman, who had finally managed to whisper her name, Soraya, was weak, but she kept up with him, her fragile steps echoing through the empty ship. Caleb glanced over at her, his mind racing. What had happened to her? Why was she in that pod? And most importantly, why did the ship seem so abandoned? He wanted to ask her questions, but every time he opened his mouth, she seemed to grow more anxious, her silver eyes darting nervously to the walls as though expecting something to jump out at them. They reached the ship's exit, only to find it sealed shut. The door, which had originally seemed so welcoming, now appeared impassable. Panic began to rise in Caleb's chest. The ship felt like it was alive, but not in a good way. It was old, forgotten, and something about it gave him the chills. Soraya stepped closer to the door, her fingers trembling as she traced a series of markings along the edges. Her lips moved silently, almost as if she were speaking to the ship itself. Caleb watched her closely, confused. Was she communicating with the ship? Could she even understand how it worked? Then, with a soft groan, the door slowly began to open, revealing the dense fog outside and the towering mountains that surrounded them. Relief flooded Caleb's chest, but his victory was short-lived. As the door cracked open, a low rumble echoed from deep inside the ship, the sound of distant machinery waking up. Caleb turned to Soraya, his pulse quickening. "We need to go. Now." She nodded silently, her body tense with fear. They stepped out into the mountain's shadow. But before they could take more than a few steps, a strange mechanical noise filled the air. Caleb whipped around, his flashlight scanning the surroundings. A faint flicker of movement caught his eye. Something small and dark was skimming the ground near the ship. Caleb couldn't see it clearly, but his instincts told him it wasn't good. Before he could react, a high-pitched whirring sound pierced the air, and tiny drones began rising from the ship's hull, their sharp metal wings reflecting the faint light of the moon. The drones moved in unison, their eyes glowing red as they scanned the area. Caleb's heart skipped a beat. He had no idea what these machines were, but they weren't here to help. He grabbed Soraya's arm. "We need to move. Fast." The drones circled around the ship, their buzzing growing louder, more menacing. It was clear now. They weren't just passive observers. They were hunting. And they were looking for Soraya. Soraya's body tensed at the sight of them. She pulled away from Caleb's grasp, her eyes flashing with a fierce determination he hadn't seen before. "They're coming for me," she whispered, her voice cold and sharp. She turned to Caleb. "We need to leave this place, or they'll find us." Caleb didn't hesitate. He turned on his heel and began running, his mind focused only on one thing: getting out of there alive. But as they sprinted down the Rocky Mountain Trail, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was coming for them was much worse than he could ever imagine. Caleb and Soraya ran through the rocky terrain, their breath coming in sharp, quick gasps as they moved deeper into the forest. The buzzing of the drones echoed through the night air, too close for comfort. Every few moments, Caleb would glance over his shoulder, seeing the red lights of the drones flickering in the distance, like fiery eyes watching them. Soraya's pace had slowed. The energy it took to keep moving was clearly draining her, and Caleb noticed that her steps were becoming more uneven. Her face was pale, and she was clutching her side as though in pain. She was still weak from whatever happened inside the ship, and the cold mountain air was only making things worse. "Hey, Soraya," Caleb said, his voice laced with concern. "You need to rest. We can't outrun them if you're not strong enough." She shook her head quickly, her eyes darting nervously around them. "No, we can't stop. They'll find us." Her voice trembled with fear. "I can't let them." She broke off as if the thought of whatever was chasing them was too terrible to finish. Caleb looked at her, his heart heavy with sympathy. He wanted to help her, but how could he? He had no idea what was going on, why the drones were after her, or how to get rid of them. But one thing was clear: if they kept running through the mountains like this, they wouldn't last long. "Okay," he said, his mind racing. "We need to hide. We need a plan. Let's get to the cabin. We'll figure it out there." Soraya nodded weakly, and together they made their way through the dense woods, avoiding the main trail. Caleb's cabin wasn't too far away, but with the drones searching the area, they had to be careful. When they finally arrived, Caleb locked the door behind them, breathing heavily as he stared out the window, watching for any signs of the drones. The cabin was small and rustic, the kind of place that felt cozy and safe, but right now it felt anything but. Soraya collapsed onto the couch, her exhaustion evident. She looked at Caleb, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and gratitude. It was clear that she wanted to tell him something, but the words seemed to stick in her throat. Caleb sat across from her, giving her some space, but he needed answers. He couldn't help her if he didn't understand what was going on. "We need to talk," he said gently. "I don't know what's happening, but you need to tell me. Why are they after you? What's going on?" Soraya took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she reached into the folds of her clothes. She pulled out a small metallic device, a sleek, circular object that looked like it belonged to another world. She placed it on the table between them. "This," she said quietly, "is why they are after me." Caleb stared at the device, his curiosity piqued. "What is it? Some kind of weapon?" Soraya shook her head. "No, it's a key to something dangerous, something powerful." She looked at him with a mixture of fear and sorrow. "And if they get it, they'll destroy everything." Caleb's mind was racing. The drones, the ship, the strange woman. Nothing made sense. But one thing was clear now. Soraya wasn't just some alien stranded on Earth. She was caught up in something far bigger than he could imagine. And whatever it wasn't just a threat to her. It was a threat to everything. The room inside Caleb's cabin felt smaller now, the walls closing in with the weight of the situation. The strange device sat on the table, its smooth surface reflecting the dim light, as if it were a thing of both beauty and danger. Soraya's eyes were fixed on it, her fingers trembling as she brushed her hand over the metallic object. Caleb could see how much it terrified her. "Who's after you?" Caleb asked, his voice steady, but his mind was reeling. "Who are they?" Soraya's gaze flickered toward the window, her eyes darting nervously toward the trees outside, as though she could feel the eyes of the enemy watching them. "They are hunters," she whispered. "A faction of my people. They came for me long ago. I escaped, but they have been searching for me ever since." Caleb frowned. "Your people? Are you saying you're from another planet?" Soraya nodded. "Yes, from a world far beyond your stars. My name, Soraya. I was once part of a group, an order meant to protect the key. But I failed them. I was betrayed. The device, She pointed at the small object. It's a key to a power, an ancient energy that can reshape worlds. If they get it, they will use it to conquer all, including your Earth. Caleb felt his pulse race. He had known there was something more to this, but now he was hearing it straight from her. He had never believed in aliens or strange powers. But this was real. Soraya was real, and everything she said felt like a heavy truth. Why didn't you just destroy it? Caleb asked, trying to understand. If it's that dangerous, why keep it? I can't destroy it, she said softly, her voice tinged with sadness. It is part of me. I was chosen to protect it, to keep it safe until the right time comes. But now, they have found me. And they won't stop until they take it. The tension in the cabin was thick. Caleb could feel it pressing in on him from all sides, but there was something else too. Something more than fear. It was a sense of purpose, a responsibility he had never expected to feel, but one that was now undeniable. He had to help her. He didn't know how, but he couldn't just walk away. Before Caleb could say anything more, a sharp noise from outside cut through the air. It was faint at first, just a rustling sound, but it quickly grew louder, too deliberate to be just the wind. He moved toward the window, his heart pounding. Out in the trees, several shapes moved with unnatural speed. Caleb couldn't see them clearly, but the flashing red lights from the drones lit up the dark forest like fireflies. The hunters had arrived. Stay down, Caleb whispered urgently to Soraya. We can't let them see us. He turned away from the window and grabbed the small device from the table. It felt heavier now, as though it carried the weight of all the danger Soraya had described. He quickly placed it into his pocket and moved toward the back of the cabin, where a small trapdoor led down to the cellar. Soraya followed him, her face tense with fear. They are coming. We don't have much time. Caleb opened the trapdoor and motioned for her to go first. They needed to hide, regroup, and think of a plan. But Caleb's mind was spinning with questions. How did the hunters find them so quickly? Were they tracking the device, or had they somehow known Soraya was here, even before she woke up? As they descended into the dark cellar, Caleb could hear the faint hum of the drones in the distance. The hunt had begun. The cellar was cold and musty, the smell of damp wood and earth filling the air as Caleb and Soraya crouched in the dark. Caleb strained his ears, trying to listen for the sound of the drones. They were still out there, searching the woods with a relentless mechanical hum. Caleb's heart raced as he wondered how long they could hide before the hunters found them. Soraya sat quietly on the floor, her knees drawn up to her chest. Her pale face was drawn with exhaustion, but her eyes remained sharp, constantly darting around the small cellar. Caleb could see the fear in her eyes, but also the determination. She wasn't giving up, and neither was he. We need to find a way to stop them, Caleb said softly, his voice barely a whisper. We can't just hide forever. Soraya nodded, her eyes glinting with a mix of worry and resolve. They won't stop until they have the key, and if we don't act quickly, they will find us, and everything will be lost. Caleb glanced around the small cellar, looking for anything that could help. It wasn't much, just old crates and shelves filled with dusty tools. But then something caught his eye, a small metal box on the far side of the room. It looked out of place among the rest of the junk, as though it had been left there long ago and forgotten. Curious, Caleb walked over to the box and opened it. Inside, he found a set of strange tools, their shapes unfamiliar and foreign. They looked like they could be from another world. One of the tools glowed faintly, its surface smooth and warm to the touch. Caleb's fingers brushed over it, and to his surprise, the tool hummed softly in response. What is this? Caleb asked, turning toward Soraya. She looked up at the glowing tool in his hand, her eyes wide with recognition. That is part of the ship's control system. It can be used to override the drones and the ship's defenses. But she hesitated, looking at the tool with both awe and fear. I don't know if it will work. Caleb held the tool tightly, a feeling of urgency growing in his chest. It's our only shot. Without waiting for a response, he turned toward the trapdoor, ready to go back outside. Soraya tried to stand, but she stumbled, her legs still too weak to support her. Caleb caught her arm, steadying her. "You stay here. I'll go out and try to stop them." Soraya shook her head quickly. "No, I need to help. If we're going to survive this, I can't just stay behind." Caleb didn't argue. He knew she was right. Together, they would have a better chance. They crept back up to the main floor, staying low and moving silently through the cabin. Caleb peeked out the window, his eyes scanning the dark forest. The drones were still circling, their red lights flashing like distant stars in the night sky. They were getting closer. He turned to Soraya. "We don't have much time." They moved quickly, Caleb clutching the strange tool tightly in his hand. Their only hope was to get to the ship and somehow use the device to disable the drones before they were found. As they made their way toward the ship, the air seemed to grow heavier, as if the forest itself was closing in around them. Caleb's thoughts raced. Could they really stop the hunters? Could they really keep the device safe? He didn't know. But one thing was certain. If they didn't act now, they would be lost. The ship loomed ahead, half buried in the rocky earth, like a forgotten relic from another time. Caleb and Soraya moved swiftly through the trees, their hearts pounding in their chests. The drones were close now, their buzzing filling the air, and the flashing red lights seemed to grow brighter with every step they took. "We're almost there," Caleb whispered, his voice tight with tension. Soraya nodded, her eyes scanning the forest around them, always on alert. Despite her weakened state, there was a fire in her eyes, a sense of purpose that Caleb could feel in the air. She wasn't going to let them take the device, not without a fight. When they reached the ship, the entrance was still open, but the interior was shrouded in darkness. Caleb hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. Soraya followed, her steps light but cautious. "We need to find the control room," Soraya said, her voice low. "It's the only way to stop the drones." Caleb nodded, gripping the strange tool in his hand. The low hum of the ship's systems filled the air, but there was something unsettling about the silence that followed them as they moved deeper into the ship. The walls felt cold and alive, like they were watching them. They reached a narrow hallway lined with doors, each one leading into a darkened room. Soraya's eyes darted from door to door, but she didn't stop. She led the way, her pace quickening as they neared the heart of the ship. Then, without warning, a sharp metallic screech echoed through the ship. Caleb froze, his heart stopping in his chest. He knew what it meant. The drones had found them. The hunters were coming. "We need to hurry," Caleb urged, his voice urgent. They pushed forward, turning a corner and finding themselves in a large control room. The walls were lined with strange, glowing consoles, but Soraya didn't hesitate. She moved to the center of the room, where a large terminal stood, its surface covered in symbols that Caleb couldn't understand. "This is it," Soraya said, her voice steady despite the chaos outside. "I need to activate the defense systems, but it will take a few minutes." Caleb nodded, his eyes scanning the room. He knew they didn't have much time. The sound of the drones outside grew louder, their buzzing filling the air. The walls of the ship seemed to tremble, as if reacting to the approaching danger. Suddenly, the door behind them slammed shut with a loud bang, and Caleb spun around, his heart racing. A figure stood in the doorway, a tall, shadowy figure wearing dark armor. The leader of the hunters. "You can't hide forever," the figure's voice echoed, cold and commanding. "The key belongs to us." Caleb's fists clenched, and he stepped forward, ready to defend Soraya and the device at any cost. But Soraya held out her hand, her voice calm but firm. "Stay back, Caleb. I can handle this." The hunter stepped into the room, his eyes fixed on the device in Soraya's hands. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he sneered. "You'll never survive this." The air seemed to crackle with tension. Caleb didn't move. He trusted Soraya. She had led them this far, and he wasn't about to doubt her now. With a sudden movement, Soraya pressed a series of buttons on the console, and the ship's hum grew louder, vibrating the walls. The lights in the room flickered, and then shifted to a deep, glowing red. The hunter lunged toward Soraya, but before he could reach her, a burst of energy shot from the ship's walls, knocking him back with a force that sent him sprawling to the ground. Soraya stood tall, her eyes flashing with power. "This is my world now," she said softly, her voice like a whisper in the storm. Caleb felt a surge of pride for her, but there was no time to celebrate. The drones were still closing in, and the fight wasn't over. "Let's finish this," Caleb said, determination in his eyes. Together, they prepared for the final battle. The ship's defense systems hummed to life, sending a pulse of energy through the walls that shook the ground beneath Caleb's feet. Soraya's hands were still on the control panel, her fingers flying over the keys with rapid precision. Her eyes were locked on the glowing screen in front of her, her focus unwavering. But Caleb could see the strain in her expression. She was pushing herself to the limit, and they didn't have much time. Outside, the sound of the drones grew louder, their mechanical whirring filling the air like an approaching storm. Caleb's heart pounded in his chest as he glanced at the doorway. The hunter, though knocked back for now, wasn't out of the fight. He would be back, and when he did, he wouldn't be alone. "We need to hold them off," Caleb said urgently, his eyes meeting Soraya's. "Can you finish this?" She nodded, her voice steady but laced with exhaustion. "I'm almost there. Just give me a little more time." Caleb didn't hesitate. He turned and rushed toward the door, gripping the strange device tightly in his hand. He didn't know exactly how it worked, but he had a feeling it could make the difference. The hum of the drones outside was getting closer, and Caleb knew that soon they'd be swarming the ship like a pack of wolves. He reached the door and peeked out, his eyes scanning the dark forest. The red lights of the drones blinked ominously in the distance. They were moving in a perfect circle around the ship, waiting for the right moment to strike. Caleb clenched his fists, ready for whatever came next. A sudden movement caught his eye. The hunter had regained his footing and was approaching with a group of soldiers, all wearing the same dark armor. They were fast, and they were closing in. "Damn it," Caleb muttered under his breath. He had no choice but to fight. There was no other way to protect Soraya and the device. Without a moment's hesitation, Caleb stepped out into the open, his mind racing. He needed to buy Soraya more time. He knew the ship's defense systems were powerful, but the drones were relentless. If he didn't act quickly, the fight would be over before it even started. He activated the device in his hand, hoping it would do something, anything to help. To his surprise, the tool hummed and glowed brighter, casting a strange blue light around him. A force field materialized in front of him, shimmering in the air like a wall of energy. The hunter and his soldiers stopped in their tracks, momentarily taken aback by the sudden shield. Caleb stood tall, his stance firm, the force field flickering with power. He wasn't going to let them get to Soraya, not without a fight. The drones surged forward, their buzzing filling the air like a swarm of angry bees. Caleb's pulse quickened, but he held his ground, focusing on the shield. As the drones closed in, they began to fire, their lasers flashing brightly, but the shield absorbed the blasts, sending them harmlessly into the air. Caleb's breath came in ragged gasps. He could feel the strain in his muscles, the weight of the energy field pressing down on him. He had to keep them back. He had to protect Soraya. From behind him, he heard Soraya's voice. "Caleb, I'm done. The ship's defense systems are online. We're ready." A surge of relief washed over him. The drones were still coming, but Soraya had done it. The ship's defenses were now activated, and the tide was about to turn. With one final push, Caleb released the energy in the device, and the shield expanded, engulfing the entire area. The drones, unable to penetrate the powerful force, began to retreat, their red lights blinking erratically as they struggled against the energy field. The hunter and his soldiers, realizing they were outmatched, took a step back, their expressions filled with frustration and disbelief. They had underestimated Caleb and Soraya. "This isn't over," the hunter snarled, but his voice was tinged with uncertainty. "We'll be back." Caleb stood his ground, the energy field still glowing around him. "Not if I have anything to say about it." The hunter's group retreated, disappearing into the shadows of the forest. The drones followed suit, their whirring fading into the distance. Caleb exhaled sharply, his body trembling from the adrenaline. The battle wasn't over, but for now, they had won. He turned to Soraya, who was standing near the control panel, her face pale but determined. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft. Soraya nodded, a faint smile playing on her lips. "We did it, but we're not safe yet." Caleb nodded in agreement. The war wasn't over, but for the first time in what felt like forever, they had a chance. The forest around Caleb and Soraya was quiet now, but it felt like the calm before the storm. The hunter and his soldiers had retreated, but the battle wasn't over. Caleb knew it wouldn't be long before they came back, stronger and more determined than ever. Soraya stood next to the control panel, her eyes focused on the blinking lights as she tried to access the ship's deeper systems. The strange device Caleb had found in the cellar was still in his hand, and he felt its weight in his palm as though it carried the burden of their survival. Soraya had explained that it was the only thing that could override the ship's defense systems fully, but to use it, they would have to make a sacrifice. It was their only chance to keep the enemy from finding them again. "We have one shot at this, Caleb," Soraya said quietly, her voice filled with uncertainty. "The ship is powerful, but the longer we delay, the more likely it is that they will find us again. We need to make sure they can never use this technology to destroy your world." Caleb nodded, understanding the gravity of the decision. The hunter was not someone who would back down easily. The more time they gave him, the more troops he would bring. They had no choice but to destroy the threat now, or it would be too late. "So what do we do?" Caleb asked, his voice steady despite the tension that gripped his chest. Soraya looked at him, her eyes full of regret. "I can set the ship's core to overload, but it will take out everything. The ship, the technology, the drones, everything will be destroyed. It's the only way to keep it from falling into their hands. But it might be too much. I don't know how much time we'll have to get away before the explosion." Caleb's heart pounded. He knew it was risky, but they had no other choice. The thought of losing Soraya, losing everything they had fought for, made his stomach twist in fear. Yet, deep down, he knew this was the only way. "We don't have a choice," Caleb said firmly. "Do it. Set the core to overload." Soraya hesitated for only a moment, then turned back to the control panel, her fingers moving quickly over the screen. The ship's walls rumbled as if responding to her actions. The humming noise grew louder, vibrating through Caleb's bones. A countdown appeared on the screen, the numbers ticking down with a steady rhythm. 5 minutes, Soraya said, her voice tight with urgency. "We have 5 minutes to get out of here." Caleb turned and started toward the door, motioning for Soraya to follow. "Let's move." They ran through the dark, twisting hallways of the ship, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the narrow corridors. The countdown in Caleb's mind kept pace with his heartbeat. The moment they stepped outside, they would have to move fast, faster than they had ever run before. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from behind them. Caleb spun around to see the figure of the hunter, his armor glinting in the dim light, rushing toward them, flanked by several soldiers. "They're here," Caleb shouted, panic rising in his chest. The hunter had found them again. "We don't have time for this," Soraya shouted back, her face pale as she moved to the control panel in the hallway. She pressed a series of buttons, and the door to the outside slid open with a mechanical hiss. "Go," Caleb urged, his eyes locked on the approaching soldiers. "Now." Soraya didn't hesitate. She bolted for the exit, her legs moving faster than Caleb had thought possible. He followed closely behind her, barely keeping up. The hunter's voice echoed behind them. "You think you can run. You're just delaying the inevitable." But Caleb didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. The countdown was ticking down, and they needed to be out of range before the ship exploded. As they burst into the open air, Caleb glanced over his shoulder. The hunter and his soldiers were still following, but they were too far behind to catch up now. They had only a few more seconds. Caleb and Soraya ran harder, faster, and then, boom! The ship behind them erupted in a massive explosion, sending a shockwave through the ground. Caleb and Soraya were thrown off their feet by the blast, the force of it knocking them to the ground. The sky above them lit up with the fiery glow of the ship's destruction. The shockwave pushed them forward, but they managed to stay on their feet, rolling as they landed to avoid injury. When the dust settled, the ship was gone, reduced to rubble, and the hunters' forces were nowhere to be seen. It was over. For now, the smoke from the explosion still hung in the air, the remnants of the ship smoldering on the mountainside. The ground was warm beneath Caleb as he lay there, breathing heavily, his body aching from the blast. His heart raced, but there was also a deep sense of relief. The threat had passed, for now, at least. He pushed himself up slowly, dusting himself off as he looked around. Soraya was sitting on the ground nearby, her knees pulled to her chest, her eyes fixed on the wreckage. She looked exhausted, her face pale, but there was a calmness in her expression now that hadn't been there before. The fear, the uncertainty, it had all faded, replaced by a quiet strength. Caleb walked over to her, his feet unsteady, and knelt beside her. "You okay?" She looked up at him, her silver eyes meeting his. For a moment, she said nothing, just studying him as though trying to read his thoughts. Then, finally, she spoke. "I think so. It's over. For now." Her voice was soft but steady, and there was a hint of a smile on her lips. Caleb nodded, glancing back at the wreckage. "We did it. We stopped them." Soraya followed his gaze, her expression thoughtful. "We stopped them. But we don't know if they were the only ones. My people, there may be others who are still looking for the key. The danger isn't over. But now, I know I'm not alone." She looked back at Caleb, her gaze warm and filled with gratitude. "You helped me. You risked everything for me." Caleb met her gaze, feeling something shift in him. He had never expected any of this. He had never imagined that his life would become part of a fight to protect an alien artifact, or that he would end up risking everything for someone from another world. Yet, in that moment, it all felt right. "I couldn't leave you," he said quietly. "I don't know what's coming next, but I'm with you. We'll figure it out." Soraya smiled, a real soft smile that lit up her face. "Thank you, Caleb. You've shown me that there is more to this world than I ever imagined. The humans I knew before, they wouldn't have done what you did." Caleb felt his chest tighten, but he didn't know how to respond. Words felt too small for everything that had happened, everything they had been through. Instead, he simply reached out and took her hand. It was a simple gesture, but in that moment, it meant everything. The sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow over the mountains. The world around them felt peaceful again, as though the storm had finally passed. The threat was gone, and for the first time since they had met, Caleb felt like they had a chance at something new. A chance to rebuild, to start over. "So, what now?" Caleb asked after a moment, looking around. "Do we just walk away from here?" Soraya stood up, brushing the dirt from her clothes. "For now, yes, but there's much to learn, much to explore." She looked at Caleb, her eyes filled with resolve. "And I'm not going back to hiding anymore. I've made a decision." Caleb raised an eyebrow, curious. "A decision?" "I want to learn about Earth," Soraya said. "I want to stay here, learn from your people, understand your world. And I want you to help me. Together, We'll figure out what's next." Caleb smiled, a feeling of warmth spreading through him. He had no idea what the future held, but for the first time, he was excited to find out. He had no plans, no idea where they would go from here, but one thing was clear: they would face it together. "We'll figure it out," Caleb said, his voice filled with confidence. Together. As they stood there, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the world felt full of possibilities. The danger was behind them, but the journey ahead was just beginning, and Caleb knew that whatever came next, he wouldn't be facing it alone.